You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're taking a look at the truce in Syria. The first United Nations observers have started work in Syria, where they are monitoring a fragile ceasefire. The advance party of 6 is expected to grow to about 30 by the end of the week, but some say that is far from enough. Violence continues in Syria despite the truce brokered by the peace envoy Kofi Annan, particularly in the rebel centre of Homs. The government of President Bashar al-Assad says terrorists have intensified attacks since the ceasefire came into effect. Those trying to topple him say the government shelling of civilian areas continues. So, will the UN observers have enough access to do their job? Will the truce prove substantial enough for the opposing sides to sit down at the negotiating table? And could Assad and his opponents reach a workable deal? To probe these questions, we're hosting a debate in our London studio. I'm joined by Manal Lotfi from Al Hayat newspaper, Saad Jawad from the London School of Economics, Yossi Meckelberg from the think tank Chatham House and Regent's College, Patrick Hayes, a political commentator for the website Spiked, and over the line from Moscow by Andrei Baklitsky from the Russian Center for Policy Studies. And to get the ball rolling, I'd like to get a single sentence answer from each of you to the following question. First of all to you, Manal, is Kofi Annan's ceasefire working?
No, not at all.
That was quick. Saad?
There are talks about it taking effect, but nobody can confirm that. There is some violence going on still now.
Yossi?
No, it doesn't work. The violence is continuing, and also the definition, what is a success? If it's going to improve lives in Syria, probably not.
And Patrick?
I agree, the definition is important here. I don't think it's working. I think in fetishizing peace in this situation, it's putting a potential Syrian spring on ice, and I don't think Assad will be able to really stomach the democratic reforms that are part of Kofi Annan's peace deal either.
Okay, and Andrei?
I would say that it's not really working. That would be a short answer. A bit longer one would be that if the situation is getting better in Syria since the process started. So we don't have what we would like to have, but it's better than nothing.
All of you were pretty negative about the ceasefire working, and I think if I play you this first audio clip, it will basically demonstrate why.
Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar.
Okay, that is the noise of continuing government assaults in Syria. Of course, it's been uploaded onto YouTube and therefore is difficult to verify. But you hear violence and shelling and air attacks on what are likely to be civilian areas. Andrei, you said that, of course, the ceasefire is not really working, but it was better than nothing. What is your reason for this positivity?
Well, I guess all of the experts which are on the ground, which are in Syria, are saying that it's less violence since the start of the talks. And it's quite reasonable because Bashar Assad is under huge pressure at the moment, so he has to show something to the international community. Otherwise, the intervention by, say, Turkey would be imminent, and there is a good reason for him to do at least something. Of course, there's a possibility that he's secretly shelling, or not that secretly shelling, some cities, but I guess everyone agrees that less people are dying since the Kofi Annan plan started to implement.
Okay, Manal, I think you're going to disagree because you said clear and simple that no, it's not working at all.
In my opinion, no, it doesn't work, and I think both sides are really paying lip service for the ceasefire because Assad is obviously under pressure, and as well the Syrian opposition is under pressure. But the ultimate goal of Kofi Annan's plan is democratic transition, and I don't think the Syrian authority is really ready for the democratic transition. So they might appear to try their best to reduce the violence, but at the end of the day, they will still continue shelling, the opposition strongholds just to make sure when the stage of political discussion will come, they will have the upper hand.
Okay, I take this opportunity to play another clip. This is one of the monitors just arriving in Syria describing how he feels about the mission.
We are going to organize ourselves in order to be ready to do our task as soon as possible.
Are you optimistic about the mission in Syria?
Of course, we're here. We are always. All peacekeepers are optimistic.
Okay, Saad, that's one of the monitors wearing the blue beret of the UN, saying that they are optimistic about their mission. Do you think they've got a reason to be optimistic?
They have to be like that, otherwise they wouldn't have accepted to go there, but they have to show some optimism. I don't know whether this is verified or not, but they have to be like that. But the problem is, in my opinion, nobody is telling the truth. Not the opposition, not the government is telling the truth. There are exaggerations. Whenever I hear things like that, I always remember what happened in Iraq, the exaggerations about the Iraqi situation. Then the country was destroyed upon propaganda and false claims, and nobody questioned that. But in Syria now, I think the question is not only internal problem. I think it is external, and I think President Bashar al-Assad is benefiting from the hesitation of the international community, and I think the restrictions put on the United States in acting in Syria as they did in Iraq or the Europeans in Libya, I think this is giving Bashar al-Assad some space to maneuver. Also, I think the opposition is so weak or too weak to enforce him to do something positive in their favor. This is another fact, despite the assistance they are getting and the lip service they are getting and the money they are getting from Gulf states or from the international community or from Turkey. But I think one should be optimistic about the situation. Otherwise, nobody could have accepted the job. Whether they will succeed or not, this is another issue. I think we have to wait and see. But I think government in Syria has been given a lifeline by these observers.
Yossi, I see you nodding your head there. Do you have any optimism as well?
I don't know. Optimism is a state of mind. It's not a policy. You need to look actually what's going to happen on the ground. It will be judged in a matter of weeks or months. Reality is that 9,000 people already being killed according to United Nations report. Many other thousands were injured. There is devastation there. And the question whether one should be optimistic or not be optimistic depends what's going to happen from now. Whether this space is a lifeline for the Assad regime to actually have a better grip on the Syrian state, and as a result of it, they will cause more death and more injuries inflicted on the Syrian people, or this is a process towards reform. And I would say that looking at the way that the international community operated so far, I think it gives the Assad regime, unfortunately, a better chance to regroup, to reassess, and to stay in power.
Andrei, can I put that one over to you? Because the Russian position has been more supportive of Syria than other countries, European and the United States.
Well, it would be not really reasonable to deny that Russia is more favorable to Bashar al-Assad than anyone else. But if we look on the other countries which are also favorable to Bashar al-Assad, at least not in talks but in their actions, these countries would be the United States of America and Israel. Because remember what the United States officials were saying. They were saying, well, there are a lot of concerns that there are some Islamists and militant Islamists or some extremists and violent extremists against the rebels. So while we are also pro-democracy and stuff, we must accept that those guys are sort of enemies. So we should think twice before supporting them. And Israel, of course, is doing like it's always doing, just standing aside, and for Israel it wouldn't be a really good thing for Bashar al-Assad to step down. So if you look on the company where Russia is standing at the moment, it would be really, really unexpected company. Even from Russia it looks a little bit bizarre. So yes, of course Russia has some interest in Syria. We have a naval base in Syria. We were selling weapons to Syria. But at the end, if you look on the possibilities that international community has, there are not so much of them, and there's clear one, there is a military intervention. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I guess the only country which is talking about the military intervention, more or less, is Turkey, and Turkey is all alone on it. Even its European allies, NATO allies are against intervening. And as you can imagine, a military intervention wouldn't be the best case scenario. The other option are talks. And when we are talking about engaging different sides together, it would be even fair that someone would be backing one part and someone would be backing the other part to bring them together, to make them talk, to make them start doing something to stop the violence.
One of the analysts that I was speaking to, in fact, a few of the analysts that I've been speaking to and reading about, suggests that the Kofi Annan peace plan was to some extent designed to fail, that there was no actual belief that it would result in a holding ceasefire, but that the fact of its failure and the continuation of assaults on rebel and opposition positions would make it more difficult for Assad's friends to stick up for him in the UN Security Council. Do you think there's a bit of truth to that, Andrei?
Well, that's an interesting idea. I don't think that some games are played that clever and that sophisticated in the international community, or I hope that they're not played, because it's like you're risking the lives of thousands to achieve something you want. Of course, if the ceasefire would be breaking and the international peacekeeping force, which I hope would be objective, would show to the world international community that it was Bashar Assad's fault and only his fault, then of course even Russia and China would not be able to support Syrian regime to the extremes, as it was in Libya, for example. But it's really always unclear who started to break into truce. As you probably heard, at the moment there are a lot of talks that on the one side Bashar Assad is cracking down the opposition, but opposition is also fighting back, and actually fighting back in different regions of the country. And when there's war on the ground, when there's civil war, it's really hard to differentiate who started first. And I wouldn't say that there could be any clear signs that it was only Bashar Assad. So from this point of view, I wouldn't believe that something that difficult would be implemented just to make Bashar Assad look bad.
Does anyone take issue with that point, that there's a kind of equivalence between the Assad regime and those that are trying to topple it?
Look, there is so many information about the Syrian opposition regrouping, using the ceasefire to regrouping and rearming, and it's even in the, some TV channels which is more or less supportive to the Syrian opposition, like the CNN. But the Syrian opposition would say, we are trying to defend ourselves. We will not allow the, governmental forces to just killing civilians and killing us and, not doing anything about it. But regarding your point about Kofi Annan's plan, if it was designed to fail, the thing is, we have to remember when the international community agreed upon Kofi Annan's plan, it was basically in a desperate situation. Like the Syrian crisis has been going for a year and more than 11,000 people killed during this conflict. So they agreed upon Kofi Annan's plan, but if each part of them have different hopeful outcomes. The Syrian regime would say, yeah, we will implement the ceasefire and then we will try to negotiate with the opposition. And they think maybe the Syrian regime would not assume democratic transition would not lead to Bashar al-Assad to step down. Maybe Bashar al-Assad or Russia or China or maybe Iran would think democratic transition would not ultimately lead to Bashar al-Assad to step down. But for sure, America, United Kingdom, France, and other countries assume as well any real democratic transition have to lead to Bashar al-Assad to step down. So maybe this particular point would lead to the plan to fail, because if the Syrian opposition understand the plan only to ceasefire and to give the Syrian regime space to breathe, they will not really implement it. They have no interest in it.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're discussing the ongoing violence in Syria and the peace plan from the UN and Arab envoy Kofi Annan. I'm joined by Manal Lotfi from Al Hayat newspaper, Saad Jawad from the London School of Economics, Yossi Meckelberg from the think tank Chatham House, Patrick Hayes, political commentator for the website Spiked, and Andrei Baklitsky from the Russian Center for Policy Studies. Patrick, on the line, I wanted to bring you back in there because you seem to have quite a fresh take on the uprising against Bashar al-Assad and Kofi Annan's peace plan. You use phrases that the Annan plan was fetishizing peace and it was putting peace on ice. Maybe you could explain it a bit further.
I think it's putting the development of Syrian society on ice. I think Kofi Annan's peace plan is about enforcing stability, really, on the situation between two fundamentally irreconcilable sides. And I think in really emphasizing peace over all else, Annan is effectively willing to allow Assad and his regime to stay in in power, and not to focus on democratic reforms and liberating Syrians necessarily. I think it is important to emphasise that this is very much him trying to forge an artificial dialogue between the two. A very telling quote from The Guardian a couple of days ago when they did a feature on some of the rebel fighters. And I think it is important when we're talking about the opposition to really not suggest that they're too coherent in the way in which they're made up, because of course you have the Free Syrian Army on the ground, which again is quite a mixed bunch of different individuals. Then you have the Syrian National Council, which is effectively in exile, which is headed up by actually a professor of sociology in the Sorbonne, Paris. So, I mean, you actually have quite a mix. There's not necessarily a coherent set of demands or a coherent set of really sense of exactly who the opposition is. I think that's important to kind of bear in mind. But the quote from The Guardian, which I thought was telling, was, "We don't want a dialogue with the Assad regime. We only want to see the end of this regime. I can't forget the memories of the slaughter of the last year or the repression of the last 40 years." And I think that's very telling because it really brings out the fact that you do have two sides here. You have the rebel groups that are fighting against Assad, and then you have Assad effectively trying to cling to power here. And what the six-point peace plan is trying to do is fudge a compromise between the two. And I really think what you have is the rebels effectively arguing, or to a certain extent, for greater democratic reforms, for the end of the Assad regime. You have Assad brutally cracking down on people and now saying he's going to tone that down to a certain extent. I don't see that lasting in the long term. I see this as basically suspending the status quo at the moment for as long as possible. And I do think, it was mentioned earlier on, I think by Andre, that because there's a sense that the UN might not be able to bring about a resolution and condemn the Assad regime because China and Russia, I think rightly, vetoed the attempt to condemn Assad earlier on in the year, they are trying to find other ways of intervening. I think the UN monitors on the ground are certainly a way of intervening, but also Turkey, I think, could become increasingly influential in terms of working with NATO to try and find ways of using the kind of the NATO convention, especially Article Number 5, to effectively perhaps cast Assad's regime as a terrorist group and recognise the Syrian National Council as a government in exile, which is waiting to come in. So I think there are a lot of strategies that are being discussed at the moment. Certainly, I've heard it being discussed a lot that there could be pressure being put on Russia and China if this falls through, if the peace plan falls through, to take it back to the UN. William Hague is saying this, David Cameron is saying this. If this falls through, Russia and China will have to condemn, or at least be much harsher on Assad than they are doing now.
Those are very interesting points. I'm wondering what you actually advocate for, though.
I advocate removal of external intervention completely in Syria. I think the UN monitors are on the ground. I think the external pressure is both intensifying the conflict to a large degree, and it's also internationalizing it and bringing in other players, and is actually making the situation worse. Now, I say that with a heavy heart because, 11,000 people have been killed in this conflict, civilians being killed in this conflict over the past year. But at the same time, I think if you look at the situation in Libya now, what's happened as a result of Western intervention, if you look at the history of Western intervention over the last 15 years, you see that actually they tend to make situations worse and leave a vacuum at the end, which is actually not desirable. I think, unfortunately, it has to be left to the individuals in those countries to resolve these conflicts. It's only through that struggle in which they can really determine a vision and a future for Syria.
Okay, maybe I'll put that one to you. Yossi, let them fight it out?
I think they need to fight it out, but they need the support. And the conflict as it is international anyway. Unlike Libya, which actually the international community could have avoided it. This is different. Syria is at the heart of the Levant in the Middle East. It's always related to what happens in Iran. It's relevant to what happens with Israel. It's relevant to Lebanon. So by definition, it's been internationalized. To the early point, it's hard for me to see how can anyone equate between the regime that is brutal and deadly to the opposition. Here you have asymmetric conflict between civilians. Yes, they're completely disunited, and this is one of the main flaws in their opposition to not only the Bashar Assad regime. It's 40 years of the Assad regime that killed tens of thousands of people. And the Kofi Annan, if it's only about stability, stabilizing the situation, keeping Assad, it probably will do nothing. This is about how to move from the Assad era, which was bloody, to one of the bloodiest in the Middle East, and moving towards something else, which hopefully will respect human rights, respect democracy, and moving on to a completely different future. I can see how the opposition can do that by themselves. I completely agree with Patrick. Shouldn't repeat the Libyan case, but the opposition should be supported outright by the international community.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're discussing the ongoing violence in Syria and the peace plan from the UN and Arab envoy Kofi Annan. I'm joined by Manal Lotfi from Al Hayat newspaper, Saad Jawad from the London School of Economics, Yossi Meckelberg from the think tank Chatham House, Patrick Hayes, a commentator for the website Spiked, and Andrei Baklitsky from the Russian Center for Policy Studies. Okay, I'd like to play you another audio clip now, and it follows on from what Yossi was talking about there, the possibility of outside intervention and support. And this is the United States Senator John McCain, who has been an advocate for arming opposition forces.
Over there, they are waiting for American leadership. We have announced that we are now providing them with non-lethal equipment. That doesn't do very well against tanks and artillery. And Kofi Annan's proposal, by the way, among other things, if it were enacted, does not call for the removal of Bashar Assad. So we need to get a sanctuary for the Free Syrian Army. We need to get them supplies. We need to get them weapons. And there are many ways to get weapons to them. We showed that in Libya. We showed it in Afghanistan and many other times. It's not a fair fight.
Sad, I'll put that one over to you. John McCain there saying it's time to arm and train the rebels. It's not a fair fight.
In his opinion, the fight in Iraq was fair when they intervened in Iraq and destroyed the country and killed more than 1 million people. This is the way we hear from people, and he speaks about Afghanistan as if the United States has solved the problem in Afghanistan and other countries. I cannot answer such a thing. I mean, he is advocating arming people so they can kill each other for a longer time. Now, the United Nations has said that they are sending observers and they are trying to bring about negotiations. Now, the opposition's outright, they said there is no negotiation with the regime. Then they would like to go on in their opposition, in their violence, and the government is, of course, going more and more violent against the opposition. And the violence will go on because people think as some other, that's why I'm taking issue with other things, like it's not only Turkey who is advocating external interference. Some of the Gulf countries are speaking about that, and even some people in the United States are also advocating this. And I think also these propaganda about the number of, yes, there are a lot of casualties, but who says that the number 9,000 or 11,000 is a true number? Nobody. We have no neutral source to verify. I can give you another example. In Iraq, Lancet Journal, a very respectable medical journal, said in 2006 there were more than 600,000 people killed in Iraq since the invasion. The United States in 2011 said no, there is only 33,000 people killed in the invasion. There are no sources, and people would like to just exaggerate. If you hear the news, you can see that every day the propaganda, or the Western media, I should say, increase the number of casualties by thousands, 9,000, 10,000, 11,000. Nobody could verify. I'm not saying that there are no casualties.
So if we can't believe any of that, what is the truth, Saad?
I think the truth that there is violence, and this violence is being fed by external powers and external sources. And of course, the Ba'ath regime is also known for its brutality for the last 40 years. So this violence is increased. And I think the only solution now is to convince the two sides to sit and negotiate and see a solution for the problem. Otherwise, the fighting will go on.
Manal, sit at the negotiating table or carry on fighting?
I think the international community have to exhaust and test and Kofi Annan's peace plan first. And deployment of the observer is just the very beginning of the peace plan. It was just starting. It is the beginning. It's a rocky, long road, no doubt about it. But it's much better than arming the Syrian opposition or, fight the conflict. Because at the end of the day, don't forget that there is so much at stake in Syria. Syria is not only internal conflict, it's regional conflict and as well international conflict. And there is so many regional power would not allow Bashar al-Assad, his regime, to collapse, and it's as simple as that. So you can imagine regional power. I mean, you can imagine regional war in the Middle East between Iran from one side and Saudi Arabia and Qatar from the other side. And you can imagine the implication on the international security if that would happen. So I think we have to exhaust all the peaceful negotiation first, and we have to force both sides, the Syrian government and the opposition fighters, to respect the ceasefire first, and then to tell the Syrian government to withdraw the tanks and to allow humanitarian aid. Because don't forget, at the end of the day, it is a humanitarian crisis as well. You have over 1 million Syrians displaced from all their cities and homes, and they need immediate help. And then we can sit and talk about the political solution, democratic transition. If that were to fail, then we can discuss other alternative. But we have to exhaust.
Do you think Assad is interested in a democratic transition?
My own estimation is no, but still.
So then how does it end?
It is the hardest question. It's really hard to imagine what will happen. It's better to exhaust the peaceful talks first.
Andre, when you were last talking, you said that the answer is going to be found at the negotiating table. But how do you get past that obvious hurdle, which is that Assad doesn't want to go, and the only way that the opposition is going to negotiate is for him leaving power?
I would say that the Yemen scenario would be a good one, when, as you remember, the Yemeni president was hit by a missile, and then later on he was evacuated to Saudi Arabia, and while he was out, the talks started. Without him, directly, but with his regime. So I see clearly Bashar Assad left to Tehran, and his family or some Alawi minorities who are still in the power, negotiating with the new council of Rebel Council, trying to find division of power in a way that would suit both. I don't really believe in a democratic transition in Syria in next, say, year or two, because it's really hard to build a democratic state like the normal democracy when everybody has a gun, and there was a year of fightings, and it's really tense all over the place, as we see in Libya at the moment. There is plenty of democracy in Libya, but I doubt someone would want to leave this kind of democracy. So I would say put more pressure on Assad, and then start talks from the position where you could negotiate, and try to negotiate the things which are negotiable.
Okay, we're running out of time, so I'm just going to let Yossi and Patrick get one more in there. Yossi?
I agree that negotiation is the best path forward, but for this you need an international community that is really determined, unlike what happened in the last 13 months, and send a clear message to the Assad regime that the way forward is stop the killing and moving towards reforms, which by the end of this reform, the Assad family won't be in control of Syria. What works for Assad is two things. One, the disunity in the opposition, and an international community that is divided. He feeds on this one, and that's what kept him probably much longer than otherwise he would have been there.
And Patrick?
I think it's really important not to just focus upon the amount of lives lost here. You have rebels in Syria who are saying at the moment, we've lived for a long time seeing our families being killed. We've lived for a long time slaves of the Assad regime, and we're willing to give up our lives in order to bring about a democratic future, in order to determine our own affairs. So I think it isn't just a numbers game. It's heart-wrenching when that happens, but it is important to remember there are broader things at stake here. This is a fight for liberation. This is a civil war. It's not just a technocratic humanitarian crisis, and it's important to recognise that it can't always be dealt with two irreconcilable sides being forced to sit around a negotiating table. Often you do have to take a step back and allow people to determine their own futures, and sometimes unfortunately that does require violence, and that does require a struggle that cannot just be managed from outside. In fact, outside opposition effectively strips people of their own ability to determine their own affairs. The basis of any democracy has to be people taking the mantle for themselves.
That was Patrick Hayes, a political commentator for the website Spike, saying that all forms of foreign intervention in Syria, even the Kofi Annan peace plan, are unwelcome. I was also joined by Manal Lotfi from Al Hayat newspaper, Saad Jawad from the London School of Economics, Yossi Meckelberg from the think tank Chatham House and Regent's College, and over the line from Moscow by Andrei Baklitsky from the Russian Centre for Policy Studies. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl. Stay tuned for the latest world news headlines.